Hi, and welcome to Yeti at Large. This is a channel focused on making the most out of what you have, no matter where you're at. Thanks for tuning in and helping out. 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now, we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men living and dead who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The Gettysburg Address is delivered by President Abraham Lincoln the afternoon of November 19th, 1863. They were dedicating the memorial to the Gettysburg battle. Interestingly enough, his speech was so concise, so specific, so accurate, that there are no actual photographs of him delivering the speech because the photographers on scene were accustomed to the speakers of the day taking several hours to get to the point. That was not Lincoln's style. I think of this address on 9/12, a day after 9/11. I think of Lincoln's leadership style and how Lincoln, like other political figures, have faced scrutiny and criticism, some of it unjust, but pervasive nonetheless. Lincoln was one time quoted as saying that everyone faces criticism at some point. You can't please everybody. But his advice was to handle it with patience, forbearance, and determination. He would ignore most of the attacks if they were petty, but he would fight back if they were particularly damaging. In preparing this speech, Lincoln was noted as quoting the Greek philosopher Euclid, and that his book, Axioms and Common Notions, was much of Lincoln's inspiration. Euclid was quoted once as saying that the whole is greater than a part, and in a civil war, dividing the country and dividing the factions down to their smallest base elements weakens the resolve greater than the sum of its parts. I see many times in modern political theater that we face much of the same tactic, maybe not as grand of a scale, but nonetheless, opponents know by dividing an enemy into their smallest components, they are much, much weaker and thus more vulnerable individually than they are as a sum. In my generation, one of the first real lessons that we've got in this on the Sunday morning of October 23rd, 1983, when the Marine garrison in Beirut was attacked by a suicide bomber. This was new to us back then. Generations now may not be able to fathom, but we didn't have a constant war in Afghanistan and Iraq and the war on terror. While we were very much at war with elements of terror in 1983, we weren't necessarily aware of it. I remember being horrified to think that 241 American Marines could be murdered so easily because of arbitrary rules of engagement that were established thousands of miles away. I had some indoctrination to this as a small child growing up in the 70s and learning about Vietnam, but I had no point of reference until I was in high school and quickly approaching service age. I remember reading the story of Lance Corporal Eddie DeFranco. He was the sentry on guard duty that morning. He survived, and one of the most astonishing things, talking about audio occlusion that happens in moments of great stress and strain, he could remember no details about the driver of the kamikaze, only that the guy smiled and looked right at him. That was a real wake-up call for all of us in high school at that time. I had had a unique experience in understanding the failures of leadership, especially when it comes to operating weapons of war. My uncle, my father's older brother, was a proud Navy serviceman. He was assigned to the USS Hobson long before I was ever born, 16 years. On the night of April 26th, 1952, the Hobson was steaming in formation with the aircraft carrier, the USS Wasp. Both of these vessels had distinguished service careers leading through World War II. The Hobson supported the landings at Utah Beach and also withstood kamikaze fire off the coast of Okinawa. But because of a mistake, as it was later ruled, the Hobson made an unexplainable turn right in front of the bow of the aircraft carrier. A ship, net weight almost 10 times her size, sliced her clean in half, and there were nearly no survivors. All of this goes to give some perspective to 9/12, the day after 9/11, when an accounting of failures of leadership, failures of communication, failures of command are beginning to be observed. It is critically important that you, as a leader in any capacity, you don't have to be on the battlefield at Gettysburg. You don't have to be standing watch at a base in Beirut. And you certainly don't have to be the helmsman of a United States naval warship. But you, in a position of leadership, are you connected and tuned in? Are you exhibiting appropriate courage in your position? It's irrelevant if you're a CPA or a general. We all have the same obligation to perform best. This is a brief tribute to our people in harm's way today. Never forget. Never forget.